Hello, I'm Selena Osuna, Coordinator for the Institute for Humanities Research and Assistant Director of the Desert Humanities. It's my pleasure to welcome you all today to the third and final event of our fall semester Elemental Speaker Series, where today we're delighted to be in conversation with Dr. Marcia Bjornerud and Matt Bell. Before we get started, I'd like to extend gratitude to those who have made this event possible. Thank you to our behind-the-scenes moderators today, Lauren Whitby, IHR Communications Specialist Senior, and Ron Brolio, Associate Director of the IHR and Director of the Desert Humanities. Thanks also to Joseph Carter of Livestream Success, who's running our streams today. You may notice that the chat is disabled on Zoom. Please feel free to ask questions for our speakers at any time by using the Q&A function on the bottom of the Zoom window or by commenting on YouTube, and our moderators will relay them to our host today. The Desert Humanities Initiative is a shared endeavor to think and practice with one another in ways that honor desert places. This series in particular has a focus on the elemental, the biological and geological representations of time, distance, and humanity that are so pronounced in desert environments. It's my pleasure to introduce Matt Bell, who will be in conversation with Dr. Marcia Bjornerud today. And Matt Bell is the Director of Creative Writing here at ASU and an Associate Professor. His forthcoming novel, Appleseed, is a book that explores climate change, manifest destiny, humanity's unchecked exploitation of natural resources, and the small but powerful magic contained within every single apple. I have a feeling that Dr. Bjornerud's book, Timefulness, was somewhat influential to his thinking and writing of the novel, and I hope we get to hear a little bit more about that today. Thank you, Matt, for joining us.
Still making rookie mistakes on Zoom by not unmuting myself when I want to talk. Thank you so much, Selena. Thank you to Ron and everyone else at IHR for joining us. Thank you to Marcia Bjornerud for joining us today. I'm so glad you're here. I will give a brief intro and then turn things over. I'll start with the sort of official bio and then try to say a couple more personal things. Marcia Bjornerud is a professor of geosciences and environmental studies at Lawrence University in Appleton, Wisconsin, a structural geologist. She has done field research in Arctic and mainland Norway, Arctic Canada, New Zealand, Italy, and the Lake Superior region. She has written on geological topics for the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Wired, and the New Yorker science and technology blog, Elements. She is the author of 2 books for popular audiences, Reading the Rocks, The Autobiography of the Earth, and Timefulness, How Thinking Like a Geologist Can Help Save the World. Timefulness was longlisted for the 2019 Penn E.O. Wilson Prize for Literary Science Writing, was a finalist for the 2018 LA Times Book Prize in Science and Technology, and the 2019 Phi Beta Kappa Award in Science Writing. As I move on from Marcia's impressive official bio, I was thinking that I would begin my own comments with a confession. One of the things I've sort of learned about interdisciplinary conversation is that, as exciting as it is, it can involve a small measure of intimidation because each person can quickly get overwhelmed in their partner's area of expertise. Today, for instance, I am entirely out of my depth in geology, a field in which I am an enthusiastic listener and learner, but in no way a practitioner. Unfairly, Bjornerud is not only a fantastic geologist, but also a brilliant writer, whose abilities as a storyteller are truly extraordinary. She's an impressively interdisciplinary writer and thinker, telling stories of the Earth and its past, present, and future, and just as capable discussing Norse myth, or Dorian Gray, or techno-utopianist geoengineering schemes as she is geology. For me, I read Timefulness immediately on its release, in part because I thought it might help me with one of the problems in the climate change novel I was finishing then. Most fiction is concerned with fairly limited timescales, but climate change was something dispersed over hundreds of years of history that would extend many thousands of years into the future. What I wanted to know was, how could I best depict that complexity in a single novel, connecting events across 1,000 years of past and present and future into a single story? In the sciences, of course, such long-term thinking is more common. 1,000 years is perhaps an embarrassingly small time to bring to a geologist. But Timefulness did in fact turn out to be a prime example of how thinking in and through time and across time what Bjornerud calls polytemporal thinking generates both individual wonder and communal responsibility. In it, Bjornerud says, "I've written this book in the belief, possibly naive, that if more people understood our shared history and destiny as Earth dwellers, we might treat each other and the planet better. I am comforted by the knowledge that we live on a very old, durable planet, not an immature, untested, and possibly fragile one. And my daily experience as an Earthling is enriched by an awareness of the lingering presence of so many previous versions and denizens of this place." It's our great privilege to have Marcia Bjornerud with us today. Join me in welcoming her. Thank you, Marcia, so much for being here.
Matt, it's my great pleasure. And hello, everyone out there in the desert. I'm going to share my screen.
Thank you so much.
Although we've all been spending far too much time on screens these last months, it's unlikely that you would find anyone, even the reality optional groups like flat earthers, who would insist that the world we inhabit is in fact only two-dimensional. Such a world was the premise of Edwin Abbott's classic, but offensively and unnecessarily misogynistic thought experiment of a novel, Flatland. The characters in the book are intellectually cramped by their incapacity to imagine three-dimensional objects or spaces. The narrator is one of the only citizens to recognize through dreamlike visions and an encounter with a quasi-divine presence called the sphere that Flatlanders, in fact, occupy only one plane within a much larger three-dimensional reality. Elites in the government are apparently aware of this, but actively suppress the dissemination of the idea of a third dimension. And it is revealed that the narrator is actually telling his story from a cell where he has been imprisoned for his dangerous knowledge. It's an interesting conceit and a potentially powerful political allegory, but unfortunately, Abbott makes his point through the intellectually cramped social hierarchy of his own time and place, depicting, for example, women as one-dimensional linear characters, not even fully to grasp the two-dimensionality of men and boys. And you can see in the illustration here of the home that the women enter through this very narrow door on the right, whereas the men require a little bit more space. And apparently with each generation, the polygons add sides, all male, of course. Anyway, I mentioned Flatland, despite its less than enlightened presuppositions, because we are, in some sense, very much like Flatlanders, living our lives largely in ignorance of an entire enveloping dimension, namely that of time. In fact, we're perhaps worse than the citizens of Flatland because we have plenty of opportunities to glimpse time, but actively choose, indeed make strenuous efforts to deny its existence. Our habit of time denial, a condition that might be called chronophobia, has many origins, the most obvious and forgivable of which is fear of our own mortality and the loss of those we love. But it's also wrapped up with personal vanity in a capitalist culture that brainwashes us into thinking that aging, the one absolutely universal and egalitarian human experience, is intrinsically bad. And all signs of it should be remedied. So don't delay and buy this patented elixir now. And of course, there are various religious groups, young earthers on the one hand and apocalypticists on the other, who foreshorten time either in retrospect or prospect. But I think the most insidious forms of time denial are the ones baked into our economic, political, and intellectual infrastructures, because these exert great power over our thinking without attracting our notice. Our economic system worships the invisible hand of laissez-faire capitalism as a kind of benevolent deity. But the hand doesn't have eyes and doesn't look very far ahead. These days, the timescales of corporate accountability extend only about as far as annual reports to shareholders. And having just survived this bruising election season, we all know too well that politics in this country is yoked to 2, 4, and 6-year election cycles that lock us into decision-making frameworks that don't even reach a decade into the future. Politicians who admit the progress on complex problems will necessarily be slow and incremental are voted out before they can serve another term. But still subtler strains of time denial pervade the sciences. In the hierarchy of prestige, the pure sciences of physics and chemistry are at the apex. Their so-called purity derives largely from their claim to universal, eternal truths that are effectively outside time. By this reckoning, biology and especially geology, which are thoroughly steeped in time and what Stephen Jay Gould called historicity, are by definition highly impure. These ideas, I think, have roots deep in Western thinking, traceable back to the Greeks and their concept of nested celestial spheres, with the domain of divine truth being the furthest from the mundane and corrupt earthly realm. 3,000 years later, we still privilege ways of thinking that can make claims to precision by creating history-free idealizations of phenomena, which, like Plato's forms, are somehow realer than actual instances of them in real life. The reductionist approach of physics, dissecting messy reality into tiny, timeless parts that can be manipulated in a laboratory, is of course a powerful way to discover how matter works. The success of physics in explaining the motions of the planets and empowering humans to overcome the limitations of our bodies through machines caused its methods to become the template for all other sciences. And in the early days of our discipline, some geoscientists struggled unsuccessfully to emulate physics, attempting to discover simple universal laws governing wild and unruly systems like rivers, oceans, or mountains. There was a proliferation in the early 19th century of grandiose theories of the earth. But no wonder, though, they fell short. These things cannot be understood apart from the dimension of time. Their character emerges entirely from their idiosyncratic histories and the constantly changing factors that cause them never to reach idealized and mathematically tractable states of equilibrium. Most 19th century geologists simply stuck to the less lofty but necessary tasks of taxonomy, classifying and cataloging the prodigious numbers of minerals, rocks, and fossils, or were dedicated to the grimy business of locating coal and ores to fuel the Industrial Revolution. And to a large extent, that remains the public perception of geology, when in fact the geosciences finally are in a golden age of new insights into how the planet works. I sometimes fantasize about an alternative timeline for the development of the sciences. How different our science and society might be if geologists hadn't had physics envy, and if something like Alexander von Humboldt's whole cloth approach to nature, embracing it in its entirety rather than cutting it into tiny pieces, had been picked up by others in the 19th century and developed then into a mature scientific methodology. And how wonderful it would have been if Humboldt and Charles Darwin had been more nearly contemporaries. Humboldt was a full generation older than Darwin, and in fact died just months before Origin of Species was first published. Darwin, as much a geologist as a biologist, and with his understanding of the power of incremental change over time, together with Humboldt's grasp of the geographic diversity of landscapes and ecosystems, there might have emerged a rich form of evolutionary natural science that saw Earth and life as co-evolving systems. Of course, there would still have been religious resistance to the implication of Darwin's ideas for human origins, but I think that the fixation on a certain kind of methodology, specifically one that discounts the importance of time and dismisses evolutionary histories as epiphenomena that are less important because they lack universality, has been just as cramping for natural scientists. And the implications of this are more than merely academic. Many of the serious human and environmental health problems we face today are the result of the failure in the early to mid 20th century to anticipate how new technologies, the internal combustion engine, chemical fertilizers, antibiotics, plastics, would interact over time with complex evolving natural systems. And because the public has long been taught to revere the certainty of physics as the measure of scientific credibility, the inability of geoscientists to be able to speak about things like future climate change in anything but probabilistic terms makes it easy for skeptics to dismiss their work. I would argue that the most important commodity that geology has yielded is the discovery and mapping of deep time, not merely the fact of the great antiquity of the Earth, but also a detailed understanding of what happened in the vast expanses of the geologic past. Of course, astrophysicists and cosmologists also deal in billion-year timescales. But I'd like to point out that geologists, including Darwin, had a sense in the 1800s that Earth was at least hundreds of millions of years old, when the leading physicist of the day, Lord Kelvin, pronounced it to be far younger. And in the early 20th century, soon after radioactive decay was discovered, geologists were already using it as a tool to date rocks, yielding evidence that the Earth was at least 3 billion years old, when astrophysicists, including Edwin Hubble, were insisting that the universe was only 1.8 billion, which is, by the way, about the age of the oldest rocks in the Grand Canyon. And double parentheses, I'd like to mention we have 2.8 billion-year-old rocks in Wisconsin. Anyway, geology is not so much about time itself as the power of time to reshape, erase, and continually recreate the world. The poet Ovid, who was thinking like a geologist 2,000 years ago, said it best. Time is the devourer of all things. Nothing maintains its appearance. Nature, the renewer, makes new shapes from old. Nothing perishes in this world, but is changed and renews itself. What is called being born is merely for something to begin to be something other than it was before, and to die is to cease to be the same. Though those things are now moved here and these there, in the final analysis, they all endure. Among the essential cognitive skills in becoming a geologist is the capacity to move freely back and forth in time, and to zoom, in the older sense of the word, in and out of different timescales. These days, satellite monitoring and numerical modeling allow us to actually watch continents moving, mountains growing, climate changing, in a God's eye view from above the earthly sphere. And yet, because of the persistent view of geology as a lesser kind of science, it is simply not featured in school curricula, and few modern earthlings have had the opportunity to learn even the fundamentals of how their planet works, or to gain any real sense for the tempos of its many interacting systems. Having some grasp of the intrinsic timescales of geologic processes and our place in the continuum of geologic time are essential for both pragmatic and, I believe, psychological reasons. We should know, for example, that it takes a few 100 million years to assemble a supercontinent, a few tens of millions of years to build a mountain belt, and about the same amount of time to tear it down again. Just 1 million years or so for a bipedal ape to evolve the capacity to speak and make stone tools. Only several thousand years for the world to transition from an ice age to a state where those apes could start practicing agriculture and begin establishing fixed settlements. And a mere 100 years for them to nudge the planet toward a runaway greenhouse condition. I understand that some people find contemplating geologic time alienating, and it doesn't help that geologic textbooks have for so long flogged people over the head with the 24-hour clock analogy. You know that if all of Earth history, 4.5 billion years, were a 24-hour period, we humans would have walked onto the stage in the last 20 fractions of a second before midnight. While it's literally true, I think it's fundamentally wrong in its emphasis. It suggests that we humans appeared out of nowhere, when in fact we have deep evolutionary roots that go back to the wee hours of the geological morning. It seems to absolve us also for our environmental sins. How could we, in that last fraction of a second, do anything that would matter to the Earth? And it's unintentionally apocalyptic. What happens at the stroke of midnight? For me, knowing how to read rocks and landscapes and recognize the many narratives embedded within them enhances rather than diminishes my experience of being an Earthling. Knowing the plot lines and protagonists of the sprawling multi-generational Earth saga and feeling their lingering presence is a source of existential comfort. I often feel that I don't just live in Wisconsin, but in many Wisconsins. The landscape is so clearly a palimpsest, written, partly erased, and overwritten many times. There are the forests still recovering from 19th century clearcutting. There are the Great Lakes and mighty rivers that governed trade routes long before Europeans arrived, legacies of the immense ice lobes that flowed down from Canada. There are the golden Cambrian sandstones marking the shores of long vanished seas. And in the north, contorted gneisses that are the surviving roots of Proterozoic mountains. Collectively, such stories tell the even grander saga of the Earth as a whole, a Bildungsroman of a planet that has matured, changed, learned, rebounded. Far more than an inert rock hurtling through space, Earth is vibrantly alive and responsive. Its evolution was never inevitable, its destiny not preordained. And in Earth's biography, we can perhaps glimpse parallels with our own lives. An understanding of time is the one sense that grows more acute with age. Sight and hearing may fade, but in growing older, one gains respect for the power of incremental growth and change, and must come to terms with the fact that there is more than one version of the world. Accepting the fact that we are embedded in time is arguably less alienating than the suggestions of some philosophers who assert that time is a human construct, which to me is a narcissistic denial of the irrefutable testimony of the rock record, or of some physicists who consider time to be an unexplained problem, some sort of bookkeeping error in our mathematical models of the cosmos. In my view, such claims are profoundly dehumanizing since they deny the reality of all of our experiences. As surely as we are made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, a little calcium, and a little phosphorus, we are also composed of pure, deep time. Understanding the geologic record provides a middle way between self-absorption and existential despair. It illuminates the unbroken path between our own moment as Earthlings in the Holocene and the cosmic timescales of physics. And it reminds us that we too will eventually be ancestors, so we might as well do our best to be good ones. And that requires embracing our timeful, temporal, temporary nature, our full four-dimensionality as citizens of Timeland. Thank you.
I get to be the one person you see clapping, but I'm sure other people are doing it. Well, I'm never getting used to the idea of like ending a talk on Zoom with no audience. It's just very odd. Thank you so much for that. It's fantastic to hear you speak and hear some of the things from timefulness in new forms. I hope we'll feel free just to sort of move conversationally as we go, but I've prepared a couple questions. I should also say to the audience, if you'd like to ask questions, we'll take those in a little bit. You can use the Q&A function, and I'll be looking at those when we turn toward the audience. I had this a little farther down my list, but I thought maybe I'd move toward it early because you sort of ended talking about the many Wisconsins, which is something I'm really attracted to and think about a lot. I first read Timefulness on audiobook. I listen to books sometimes on trail running. So I first read it running in the White Tank Mountains west of Phoenix, and went for a long run and was listening to your book. I love the White Tanks, and I was looking them up today, and ASU's own Stephen Reynolds, a geologist here, online had written that they were formed through tectonic activities as part of a detachment fault sometime in the mid-tertiary period, about 30 million years ago, which of course is something I didn't know running through them, right? I sort of see them. But one of the things that I love about the White Tanks, and I love about being here in the Sonoran Desert in general, is that to me, time feels present on the surface, right? Like I sort of feel like I'm experiencing that. Your picture of the Grand Canyon, my wife and I hiked, the corridor through the Grand Canyon, a year ago, and the way you sort of see time, but also like that we're not really able to name it. We don't have the ability to sort of like give name to the things that we see. And then also knowing that growing up in Michigan, also being a Midwesterner, I was fascinated with what like our state had looked like pre-settlement, pre-colonization, this imagined past of like the surface of the place, which is all a way of saying that I'm really attracted to the way you narrate in the book, living in this historical and geological and botanical sort of Wisconsin's all sort of blended together. And that's where you talk about the polytemporal way of thinking, and which is all a super long way of me asking, how do you teach that kind of thinking, which seems so important? That's the ability. It's very easy to live in Phoenix and only see the newness of lots of the city, right? It's not as old of a city as other places, and to not see the layering of the place you're in so many different ways. Does that require sort of a multidiscipline learning? Is that something that geology leads students to? How do your students sort of react to that when you're in the field together?
Well, I think it's definitely one of these sort of metacognitive skills that you can't lecture about it. It's
Right.
something that only develops with practice and with the physical experience of being in the natural world and on its own terms. And that's been especially frustrating for us these last 8 months, trying to do this virtually. As wonderful as many of the technological resources are, there's just nothing like using your feet to learn.
Mhm.
Measuring things with your own body and getting a sense for scale, the spatial scale of the landscape and the temporal scale too of its development. I think it's just something that takes practice, and some people come to it more easily than others. But that's kind of the central challenge of teaching the geosciences is helping people develop that. And it's you can learn about it, but you have to kind of internalize it through direct observation and experience, I think.
I love that in thinking about like, are you internalizing like different clocks, or you internalizing the ability to, when I was a kid, I loved in encyclopedias, the like layovers, the overlays, like the see-through like body overlays. Like thinking of like your mind working that way, like being able to sort of like layer on, like, I'm seeing this history and I'm seeing this, this geological activity that happened here. I'm seeing the seasons. I know moving to the desert, I had a really hard time with the seasons here initially because they're
Mm.
subtle compared to like the seasons in the Midwest. And my first year here, it felt like time was not passing. And I got like every day was hot and bright, you know? And I remember feeling this like weird sadness that like I had been like set loose from time. And it took a while to sort of like just learn to be with the rhythm of time here, which is
Well, and
just,
I can make a generalization to a longer time scale there, that different places have different geologic tempi. tempi.
mm,
Um, Here in Wisconsin and Michigan, the ice age seems like it just happened the other day. You just, casual look at the landscape, you see moraines. It's so obvious. These are glacial deposits. They're 18,000 years old, and they're almost unchanged in that time. And I was lucky enough to have a sabbatical in New Zealand a few years ago on the South Island, one of the most tectonically active parts of the world.
mm,
Erosion rates are just on hyperdrive there. There's no part of the landscape that is older than a few thousand years there because the whole place is being torn down. So I, even after being in the geosciences for a long time, had to recalibrate my sense of what was possible in 10,000 years. So
yeah.
different places have different rhythms to them, seasonal and geological, depending on where they are in their cycle of samsara, creation and destruction.
Right. It's so funny, of course, to think of the thousands of year speed being like a new and exciting speed, right? It's just like, oh, this is so fast. Still sort of learning that, which is really interesting to think about. I feel like that must be part of what like studying geology in different landscapes has offered you. That it's hard. Maybe if you only get to see one landscape, if you're students who are like from here and haven't been other places yet, it's hard to imagine a different sort of natural process. I mean, I feel that way being from the Midwest. That was sort of all I knew for a long time. And like the fast version of geology was like erosion at the lakes, right? And the rest felt very static in a certain way to me. Um, yeah, thank you for that. I wondered if I could trick you into talking a little bit about one of my favorite parts of timefulness. And maybe I'll quote it to you and then go your way. I love this observation every time I've read the book, where you said, as one studies geology, one begins to understand that rocks are not nouns but verbs, visible evidence of processes, of volcanic eruption, the accretion of a coral reef, the growth of mountain belt. I love the way that this took what seemed static to me at first glance, like a mountain ridge or the desert, for instance, and makes into something that is happening now, that's acting on and being acted against. And I wonder if learning to think this way changes your sort of perception on a day-to-day basis. It's a hard idea for me to hold on to, but every time like I'm sort of like in it, I'm like out in the desert thinking like, the things I see are verbs, the things I see are actions. Everything like vibrates sort of with energy. Like there's that sort of that feeling of possibility goes way up. It does, the stackness does go out of the world. In that idea, for me, that sort of metaphor is really useful in being.
Well, absolutely. I mean, you write fiction there are stories embedded everywhere. And I mean, I use a lot of text metaphors because they are very apt. And once you learn to read, you can't really learn to unread. It's like, you don't want to read a billboard driving down the highway, but you know what it says. And it's the same thing once you've learned to read landscapes and rocks. They're little fragments of text, and whether or not you want to read them, they're saying something to you. And if you're lucky, there's there's enough there that there's a narrative then, and you can engage with that in some way. And yeah, for me, it really is a source of meaning in my life. It provides a sense of connection. And I actually, when I go somewhere that I don't know the story, I feel kind of aggravated until I get it. It's like, I don't understand you. What's your what's your idiom here? I don't feel settled until I kind of get the landscape's narrative.
Yeah, that makes so much to me. And that sort of feeling like, because you can be like bereft of the knowledge you have now in the place you're used to. You sort of have, it's kind of like moving to another city and not knowing where anything is. I've done very, very little sort of COVID traveling, and just once or twice had to be out of town early on, and feeling like I was out of my loop even, and sort of like realizing how dependent I'd got on this like spatial sense at home, where I would just go to these places I knew I was safe in a certain way at a certain time, and to feel like it's really easy to be unmoored from sort of time and space right now in odd ways that I wouldn't have noticed traveling before, because I wouldn't have had to worry about safety in the same way.
Yeah. On the other hand, geology is, at least it's not universal, but it's, earth-wide. And so even if you don't speak the language of a particular place or know the culture, you can read the landscape. And so there's something really empowering about that. You can travel anywhere and make sense of a place.
Yeah. That's really, I think a lot of, as a writer, I think of when I'm working on a book, the thing I'm working on accrues its own kind of like form of attention. Like there's a way of like seeing the world through the book I'm writing, right? Like sort of its concerns start, you interpret things you're seeing through the thing you've been thinking about all the time.
Well,
And
that
I'm
happened
sure
to me.
that's
Matt was good enough to give me a glimpse of your book. And I'm seeing the world right now through that.
It's good. Maybe we're a mutual sort of sharing of windows in a little bit a way. It's very nice. Yeah. I think that's one of the things I love about reading, right? Some of the things I love about learning sort of generally is that way that it shapes your perception for a while. My wife is a chemist and has undergrad in biology and other things, and she's studied as like a master naturalist certification here, and continues to like learn the names of all the things in the desert where neither of us are from. And even just the way like you have to name what you see lights it up, and sort of makes, and you see the next layer because you can see the first one, and
Exactly.
or you can name the first one.
You have a personal relationship with something, its name. And I think that's the beginning. I think too much emphasis on taxonomy is part of geology's problem as a kind of dull science. People think it's just identifying rocks, but that's the first stage to understanding their biographies. But I think that the lack of a vocabulary for the natural world is a real impediment to people engaging with it. If you don't have a first name relationship with it, everything is anonymous. It's undifferentiated.
Yeah, I think, one of the first people I met when I moved to Arizona is Selena, who's hosting us today. And some of her own work, she talks writing about the metaphor of the desert as like empty, as being a harmful sort of, this idea of the desert as barren or lifeless, which is obviously not true when you spend time in the desert. But it is what a lot of people see when they look at it who haven't spent time in it. And it takes a while for that life to sort of become known to you. I would never think that now, but I'm sure I did when I first sort of moved here in that way. I was thinking a little bit about, as you're talking about metaphor, and you mentioned a little bit already, what the metaphors we use when we talk about science or scientific processes or theories. When I was a kid, my dad would talk to me about like the theory of relativity, and he would do like the bowling ball and the blanket and like the twin paradox and things like this. I just thought my dad was brilliant and made these up. And then later I realized like these are the metaphors everybody uses to explain these things, or many people use to explain these things. And I almost can't think of those theories apart. I only think of them through the metaphors that I sort of learned them in. Are there metaphors that you feel like are operating in sort of geology, or the way maybe lay people think about geology, they're in the way of the kind of polytemporal thinking, or a metaphor that would be better for sort of the kind of thinking that we're discussing?
Well, first of all, I think probably all science is metaphor at some level.
Yeah, I agree.
The natural world is so much more complex than we can grasp. So we just need to have stand-in models for things. But um, I mean, in the geosciences, I've been around in the field long enough now to really see how the metaphor of Earth as something like a superorganism, which was sort of anathema in the
Mhm.
1970s and 80s. People have probably heard of the Gaia idea, Gaia hypothesis. James Lovelock, still with us at age 100, positing that Earth is in some sense a superorganism that has the capacity to regulate its body chemistry. When
Mhm.
this first came out, it was embraced by sort of new age thinkers. It was really a taboo in the sciences,
Mhm.
not at all embraced. Even though Lovelock is an atmospheric chemist, a very accomplished scientist. I remember vividly there was a conference held by the American Geophysical Union, and people were very upset that the AGU would even talk about this in a
Mhm.
professional meeting. Over the last 30 years, although people don't use the word Gaia, the idea of Earth as having a kind of physiology and the new subdiscipline of biogeochemistry have emerged and are very well established. There are graduate programs and new people being hired in those fields these days. So that's, to me, that's just fascinating that a metaphor that was really rejected for all kinds of complicated reasons, partly for the things I was talking about in my talk. It wasn't a mechanistic depiction of nature,
Mhm.
has slowly been accepted and is now kind of mainstream. So I'm not sure if that's what you really
Yeah, no,
wanted.
absolutely. I think that's exactly it. That think of the ways that metaphors like let us see and then also make us blind in some ways, right?
Yeah,
Or make it sort of difficult.
we need
Um,
them, but then when we become too attached to them, they can be blinkers. Um, so I've become, as I get older, more and more fascinated with the intellectual history of the sciences,
mhm.
and seeing how forces in the larger zeitgeist affect the way scientists think about what they do.
Yeah, and of course they do. It makes total sense, right? That would
We're
be
embedded in the culture as well.
absolutely, yeah. I was, and maybe this is sort of a segue to the next thing I wanted to ask you about. Um, One of the things I'm most drawn to in your work, or I think that maybe the most utilitarian sort of way I find it really useful is this idea of like temporal illiteracy, which we've been talking about in, I think, different ways. Um, and maybe I'll read the quote for people who are in the audience who haven't read the book. You write, "We in the 21st century would be shocked if an educated adult were unable to identify the continents on a world map. Yet we are quite comfortable with widespread obliviousness about anything but the most superficial highlights from the planet's long history. Bering Strait, dinosaurs, Pangea." I read that parenthetical and I was like, oh, those are the three things I love best about geology. I was like, right, I'm one of those people. I was like, I like lit up. I was like, the Bering Strait, dinosaurs, Pangea. Most humans, including those in affluent and technically advanced countries, have no sense of temporal proportion. The durations of the great chapters in Earth's history, the rates of change during previous intervals of environmental instability, and the intrinsic timescales of natural capital like groundwater systems. So I first read this when the book came out in 2018, which was well before, of course, our current pandemic year. And my initial interest was in the term was thinking about the difficulty people have with thinking about climate change and our own role in it, just like sort of seeing that through time, how the choices we make today are going to be felt in the future, how choices that were made before we were born were living. But this week, as I reread the book, I was thinking about it again, perhaps as people began traveling for Thanksgiving during COVID, and how the relatively non existent in geologic terms time delay and cause and effect parts of like COVID exposure, diagnosis, or COVID spreading seem difficult for people to grasp. People don't want to grasp them, or like this ability to think of cause and effect in like weeks is sort of like just seems impossible for many of us. Even I think people who know better feel really easy like discarding it a little bit. Um, and maybe this is I'm asking the same question different ways, but are there ways that as individuals we become better readers of time to stick with that sort of literacy metaphor? How do we sort of link this training ourselves on durations and rates, intrinsic timescales of large scale geologic events, how can we bring that to this like inability to do it in like the small cycles of our sort of daily lives?
Yeah, I've been struck by exactly the same thing. It is sort of depressing. How can we possibly act on climate change when it's, even when people's personal health is at risk, they're not able to do the right thing. I think it takes practice and it takes political will. I mean, it's what we need is a cultural change, and that's the hardest thing. We have the science,
Right.
we potentially have, the technology, but we need a change in the culture, and that's where you writers of fiction can help. I remember from a long ago anthropology class I took in college. I don't know whether he's held in esteem anymore, but an anthropologist named Clifford Geertz had a definition of culture as something like the constellation of stories that a group of people tell about their place and purpose in the world. And in the West, in the main, those stories do not include nature.
Right.
The nature is the backdrop. It's expected to just be there, the scenery, unchanging, reliably producing, and we need to change that set of cultural stories. The nature is actually directing the play.
Yeah.
The scenery is the director, and how do we change? I'm a geologist. I don't know, but I've come to realize that really the only thing that can shift behaviors, maybe in addition to a carbon tax and some clever economic policy,
Right.
is ultimately a slow incremental change in the culture.
Yeah.
And fiction, honestly, is truly potentially one of the most important tools.
Well, in my own life, I think of how many things how many political things I care about came to me through story first, right? It's like I cared about them in a story, and then I cared about them in the world, which has been true. When I was first working on this next novel, my dad asked me, he asked me about working on. I was telling him about climate change. He's a historical climate change skeptic who no longer is because it's 2020, thankfully. And his question was sort of like, do you think this would be like your book will like save the world? And I'm like, I'm just hoping it helps me like figure out what I'll figure out what I want, what I think and how I feel, and maybe it'll help somebody else do that. And I think that's usually the real thing. Like the work I do tends to like help me figure out a bit more ethical place or more intellectual place to stand. And you assume maybe it'll do it for other people, but it seems like you're part of that constellation maybe, as opposed to like direct lever of change, right?
Yeah, I mean, and one thing I struggle with, and I think I mentioned this in the book, is that people just don't have an appetite for stories that don't have human protagonists. Geology's got lots of stories. I think they're fascinating, but how do we tell those stories in a way that captures people's imaginations if we're not in them always? So
We're starting to have really good novels with animal protagonists that are really like, and not just anthropomorphized, right? Like interesting novels led by animals. There's a book called Land Beast by Kate Weir that's real short novella about rhinos. That's really from like the sensibility of a rhinoceros, for instance. I really love, and some others. But I think it's interesting to think like what a novel from like the perspective of like a geological process would look like, or whether like how would you sort of do that in a way that's not just personifying it, right? Like there's a children's book version of it that I feel like is what most people write when they try that. It's like a rock learns a lesson or something, which is not exactly
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
Although actually, again, the American Geophysical Union this past, I think just this summer, launched a kind of special initiative. A select number of technical papers were chosen to be illustrated by graphic novelists.
Oh,
and these were technical things, but one that was really, I think, quite successful was a paper about how mangrove swamps can protect against hurricanes. Protecting them, and it was well done. I mean, it was visually arresting, and it did anthropomorphize the trees, but it got the technical. I mean, it was fairly technical. There was science in this thing, and it was like a comic book. So I think that we have to be really creative. I think there are some interesting fusions of expertise that could happen. And I mean, your book is an example.
Well, thank you for that. I taught a class on climate fiction and eco-fabulism a couple of years ago, and it was really interesting. And it was through the lens of like genre fiction, so it was science fiction and fantasy that was sort of dealing with those things in some ways. And it was really interesting how a lot of students took the class because they wanted a class on genre fiction, and then they would get like really engaged in like the history of water rights in the West or something, right? What we were reading, like Paolo Baccaluppi's Water Knife or something, and which was set in Phoenix and a future Phoenix, and is really about that. And students who'd lived here their whole lives had like not noticed like the irrigation canals that go through the city, right? Which and sort of that way that you learn a little bit from somewhere else, and it wakes you up to the next leap.
It was part of a narrative. That was the scaffolding, and
I want to take some questions from the audience. I have one thing that is I'm not even sure I quite got to a question yet. Maybe I'll find the question while I'm talking about it. I was reading your book and thinking about the work that I've sort of done trying to think about longer time in my own novel. I realized that maybe one of the things I did figure out writing the novel is that I feel I wrote the word terror. So I use the word terror at the idea that the choices I'm making now, like burning fossil fuels, for instance, will reverberate through centuries or millennia of time, and I was thinking about, like, as a writer, this idea of being like Shakespeare or something, in like 500 years, your ideas are still on earth because people are reading them, remembering them. And I realized I maybe have like this opposite want, that what I really want is to like live within the time I'm on the planet sort of well, and like not after, like to reduce the harm or the effect. Leave. I want like an ethics of like leave no trace as a economy or something. And I don't know that exists or is even possible. I mean, everything probably affects geologic record to some level, but I don't know. I don't know if my time sense has become a like wanting to be less in the future than maybe is the norm in our society. It's not a question. I haven't gotten to it yet.
Leave good stories, but leave less carbon.
Right. I don't know. I don't know if your time sense or what you want from time has changed as you've studied geology or written your books.
Well, I've been so steeped in this, it's hard for me to not remember thinking this way. But I mean, I think my relationship with time has changed more than anything as I've gotten older and, had more life experiences, had children grow up and go through different life stages. My human experience of time is probably what's evolved more than my scientific, but they've become sort of grafted together in a way that can't be disentangled at this point.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. No, I think that makes total sense to me. If you're up for it, I'm going to take a couple questions from the audience. People have been writing some great questions here, and I'd love to bring these in. Wendy Wagner, who's a fantastic editor as well, has joined us today, and she wrote, Jackie Morris and Robert McFarlane have a book project called The Lost Words, which collects natural terms that have been expunged from the Oxford Children's Dictionary. And Wendy asked, do you think people in general have enough exposure to the language of geology? Do we talk about rocks and landforms nearly enough?
No, absolutely not. I mean, again, it's such a tragedy to me that geology is just not represented in our public schools. I don't know if that's true in Arizona.
I don't know either.
I mean, kids maybe in 8th grade here have earth science. It's taught generally by people with very little background. And if it's in the high schools, it's often a course for kids who aren't college bound, which is okay. I mean, but it's definitely, it's just not highlighted. There's no AP test in geology. It's a lesser science. That's the message that people get. And again, if it's taught at all, it's about things rather than processes.
Mm-hmm.
So I know, and I've taught quite a few elder hostel type courses over the years. We have a lovely lodge on Lake Michigan on the Door Peninsula. I don't know if Matt.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
And I've come to appreciate that there's a huge appetite that many people have for being able to understand landscapes that they've grown up with, especially as people get older. So many things change. The flotsam and jetsam of popular culture comes and goes, but the landscape remains, and people really do earnestly want to understand it, but they've had so little opportunity to do that. It's kind of hard to, in a week's course, to get people up to speed with everything they need to know. So I think it's tragic because there's a kind of spiritual solace in being able to interact with the landscape, and it's tragic because this is right at the heart of our environmental problems. People have no idea about how climate has changed in the past, or what the typical residence time of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is. So yeah, geology is, I've said this before, a weird hybrid of the pragmatic, it's all about resource extraction and oil and gas and minerals, and the philosophical. And for both reasons, we urgently need people to understand how the planet works. And no, people in general don't have the vocabulary, and they haven't been given the opportunity to even have the most rudimentary understanding of the Earth's history.
Thank you.
But it can start. I mean, there are lots of resources out there, and it can start by, just understanding what's in your own region, and then that can be the scaffolding for building a larger understanding.
I think it's intoxicating for me at least, to meet someone who knows that kind of thing too. Like, one of the things I love about traveling and speaking other places when you don't get to do it on Zoom is if someone shows you around their place. And so many people in academia are transients and sort of end up in places they didn't come from. And every once in a while you meet someone who's just like really adopted their new place.
Mm-hmm.
And they know like the history of the whole college town, and they can show you the things and take you on a hike. And it's just like, I so love that, like, when someone just gives you entry to a locale in that way, which is maybe part of that sort of step.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Lauren Mosley says, and I think we're answering this question, but I'll ask the question again, partly because I want to get to her compliments as well. Says, do you think humans have issues wrapping their brains around large-scale numbers in general, in addition to deep time? I have a theory that inability to grasp these numbers worsens our economic inequality. Parenthetical. Also, I love timefulness. It made me cry.
Yeah, I mean, big numbers are tough always. And I can't say that I honestly understand what a billion years is, but I think it's developing this sense of temporal proportion, as I say, some depth of field, some sense of distance, that, we have some mental maps of how far away things are. Some things are near-ish, some things are pretty far, some are really far. And I think that's the best we can do. Start developing that kind of just a sense of proportion with time. And it takes practice. I think it takes desire to want to develop that, but I don't think it's something that you can just read. You can see, 10 to the 9th, 10 to the 8th, whatever. It doesn't mean anything until you start filling in those great expanses with stories. Then you start saying how, these stories unfold. This thing was going on at this time, and this thing was going on at this time, and this is how they intersected. This one took 10 times longer than that thing. That's the key.
I think that seems really wise. I feel like when I was learning history, like, history has isolated events. They don't connect to anything, and they just like float in your brain. And then you start realizing, like, this happened before this thing happened. Even learning literature is that way, right? Like, when I just would read a Hemingway novel and a Woolf novel, but not know that they were contemporaries or something, right? Like, you don't have this sense of like these things are happening together or around each other or in response to each other. I remember the first history class in college where people taught, like, it was taught as like a progression of like ideas and forces that were causing historical events, as opposed to just like memorize the dates of the events or something. I was like, oh, like, history is a thing that happens instead of a thing that happened. And that shouldn't be like a wild thought, but I remember having at 19 having my mind blown by that idea, And obviously geology has a similar ongoingness that is easy not to know if you just learn this, like, one thing here and there.
Yeah, absolutely. And that also reminds me of a useful contrast that I bring up sometimes, is the difference between kronos and kairos, which are these two Greek conceptions of time. Kronos is just, the raw measurement of time. Kairos is time in a narrative. And yeah, the kind of logic of a story again. And I think that's useful. It's the kairos that's really interesting. The kronos, just the measurement, is important, but that doesn't really help us internalize the meaning.
Mm-hmm. Makes total sense to me. You know, this is the weirdest maybe side thing about trying to learn numbers of proportion. I made this choice in the novel in the future part to have to switch the US over to the metric system. I just felt like it should get done. So even though things
Finally.
are kind of kind of bad in the future, I'm like, I'll fix that at least. And then I realized I couldn't think in the metric system very well. Like I didn't know how big things were. I'm like, how big is like a horse? Like 7 meters tall? Like I just like it threw off my sense of proportion to give up my system. I just had to like rebuild my ability to think in that way. It was interesting how much my spatial sense, even imaginatively, was related to this language I was used to using for it, and that swapping it out was really challenging in a certain way. There's a phrase in your book. I think it's a Buddhist phrase that you translate. Is it sati that translates in one of the translations is like the memory of the present? I found that like a really affecting and sort of like beautiful way of sort of thinking about like being present in time, but already being in the future or simultaneously being in the future. I'm sure I'm not thinking of it the way it's used, but I've thought about that a lot since reading that passage.
Well, I think many other cultures that are still with us and in the past had much more sophisticated relationships with time than we do. We think of time as this linear thing. And I quote Bruno Latour, saying that, you know, modern humans kind of feel like we're burning up the past as we go through it. I can't remember exactly the quote, but that's kind of the idea we have, that it's gone.
Yeah.
But other cultures have this feeling that the ancestors are still with us. The past is very much with us. And in a way, that's the geologic worldview too. There's so many lingering ghosts of the past. And I have, Scandinavian background. I grew up with all the Norse mythologies. And those are another illustration that in some ways those stories happened and yet they're going to happen. Are they past or future? Or when exactly where are we with respect to those? And so I think that there's much to be learned there. This leaving behind a rather simplistic idea of time as this linear thing.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a Norse one as well in the book. You say weird is
Yeah.
yeah. That has a similar sort of like the present that is being affected by the past, which feels like
it's a circular thing.
it's like such a good way of sort of thinking about time. And I love any of those retellings of sort of Norse myths where the people inside the myths are really aware of that time cycle around them. That's just so attractive as sort of a like this is happening now, but that thing that we all know about is happening later, or it happened in the past. And just like the sort of metafiction almost of that is very attractive to me. I know we're butting up against the end. I want to ask this is one last question. It's actually the first question was asked. I think it came out of your starting with Flatland. The question is, if we're all citizens of Timeland, what are our rights and responsibilities?
Well, first to acknowledge that time passes.
Yeah.
And to have some sense of, as you were saying, what is the time scale of our own effects, good and bad? I think developing temporal literacy in whatever way we can, even if it's only on historical time scales, opting out of this just insanely accelerating culture of technology that keeps us hurtling forward in the now without ever giving us a moment to reflect. Although maybe COVID is our moment to reflect. Just being deliberate about thinking of our place in time would be a good start. And reading good books.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Marcia. I think this is a nice place to end. Weirdly, like watching the time, right? And sort of like being sort of cognizant of that in our discussion. Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to get to speak to you and to have you here with us today. Thank you very much. And I know people can't clap, so I'll clap, but thank you very much again.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you so much, Marcia and Matt, for this conversation. It's fascinating getting to spend the time listening to you talk about time, engaging with time, rocks, craft, and also the responsibility and the responsibility of creativity. And humanists also, right, in generating cultural shifts towards action and awareness around climate change. So I know I'll be thinking about this conversation for all the times to come. And I want to bring it back to thanks again, to our ground control team and our live stream expert, Joe Carter, for ensuring that this ran smoothly. And to our audience, I really hope that you've enjoyed this presentation and conversation. And we'll seek out the Desert Humanities Initiative should you have any interests or projects you'd like to share with our community. I'd like to end by echoing Marcia's wisdom today. We as humans are composed of deep time. And it's for this and many reasons, it's important to be timeful. Thank you and take good care.
Thank you.